My sister walked down the aisle before me at my wedding and announced, "Everyone should know the prettier sister wears white too." She was wearing the exact same wedding dress I'd tried on at the boutique 3 months ago, but decided was too expensive. The one I'd sent her a picture of saying I wished I could afford it. Except she'd added a longer train and a crown that made her 3 inches taller than me. My guests turned in their chairs to watch her walk down the aisle that was supposed to be for me in 10 minutes while the wedding march played on the speakers. "What are you doing?" I grabbed her arm as she passed the room where I was waiting with my bridesmaids, but she shook me off and kept walking toward my groom Adam, who was standing at the altar looking confused. "I'm making an entrance. You always said the most important part of a wedding is the entrance." She spread the train of her dress across the entire aisle so no one could walk past her. My wedding planner was frantically trying to stop the music, but my sister had given the DJ $500 to keep playing no matter what happened. "That's my dress. The one I wanted." "How did you even know?" I followed her down the aisle in my actual wedding dress, which suddenly felt cheap compared to hers. "You left your browser open at Mom's house. I saw you'd favorited it, so I bought it. It was on sale for $8,000, which is nothing for someone who actually has a successful career unlike you." She did a slow turn at the altar, making sure the photographer got every angle. Adam tried to step away, but she grabbed his arm. "We need comparison photos so everyone can see who wears it better." My mother was sitting in the front row taking pictures with her phone. "Mom, tell her to change. She can't wear white to my wedding." But my mother just shrugged. "Rebecca looks stunning. You should be happy for your sister. She never gets to dress up like this since she's too successful to date." Rebecca smiled at the crowd of 200 guests we'd invited. "Since I'm already up here, I should explain why I deserve to wear white more than the bride. I'm 32 and I've saved myself for marriage, unlike my sister who's been living with Adam for 2 years. White represents purity, and I'm actually pure." My aunt gasped from the third row. Several of Adam's relatives started whispering. "You told everyone we weren't living together," Adam whispered to me, looking panicked. "My grandmother thinks you're a virgin." Rebecca heard him and laughed into the microphone she'd grabbed from the officiant. "She's not, but I am. So technically I'm the only one here who should be wearing white according to tradition. Plus this dress costs 4 times what she paid for hers, which means I'm honoring the institution of marriage more through financial investment." She pulled out her phone and showed the receipt to the crowd. $8,000 for the dress. $2,000 for the alterations to make sure it fit better than hers would have. $500 for the crown because queens deserve crowns. And $3,000 for these shoes that make me taller than the groom, which proves height. Doesn't matter when you have confidence. My bridesmaids were trying to pull me back to the changing room, but I couldn't move. Adam's mother stood up from her seat. "This is inappropriate. You need to leave." Rebecca turned to face her with this sweet smile that I knew meant she was about to say something horrible. "I'm sorry, but who are you?" "Oh right, the mother-in-law who won't even have the prettiest daughter-in-law in the family photos. How sad for you. But don't worry, I'll be in all the pictures to make up for it." She positioned herself next to Adam and called the photographer over. "We need some shots of what this wedding could have looked like with an upgrade." The photographer looked at me helplessly, but Rebecca pulled out a checkbook. "I'll pay you triple to take photos of me with the groom. Think of it as practice for when I get married to someone even better than him." Adam stepped away from her. "This is insane. Someone call security." But Rebecca had thought of that too. "I already paid security to take a long lunch break. I also paid the catering staff to serve the cocktail hour early so people would be drinking and relaxed for my entrance. Oh, and I paid the band to play my favorite songs during the reception instead of your basic playlist." She walked over to where I was standing, frozen in my dress. "You chose the venue, the date, the guest list, and the groom. The least you can do is let me have the dress since I actually have the body for it. Look how it hangs on me versus how yours would have looked." She stood next to me, forcing a comparison. "See? Same height, but I fill it out better. My trainer says I have perfect proportions for a mermaid silhouette. You're more of an A-line body type. It's not an insult, just genetics." My dad finally stood up from his chair where he'd been sitting silently. "Rebecca, that's enough. Go change." My dad's face turned red in a way I hadn't seen since I was 16, and came home 3 hours past curfew. He moved fast for someone who usually avoided conflict, stepping between Rebecca and Adam with his hands clenched at his sides. Rebecca stopped mid-pose with her phone still held up for another selfie. My dad pointed toward the exit with one shaking finger and his voice came out low and hard. He told her she had exactly 2 minutes to leave the venue or he would remove her himself. The steel in his tone made even Rebecca pause, her smile faltering for the first time since she'd walked down my aisle. She lowered her phone slowly and looked at our mother like she was waiting for backup. My mother stood up from her front row seat so fast her purse fell to the floor. She grabbed my dad's arm with both hands and her voice came out in a harsh whisper that somehow carried across the ceremony space. She said he was overreacting and making things worse, that Rebecca was just having fun and he was embarrassing the whole family more than Rebecca had. 200 guests sat frozen in their chairs watching my parents argue while pretending not to watch. Rebecca moved to stand behind her bouquet, which matched mine exactly down to the white roses and baby's breath. She had this smirk on her face like she was enjoying watching our parents fight over her. My dad shook off my mother's hands, and his voice got louder when he said that Rebecca had sabotaged my wedding on purpose, and she needed to leave now. My mother's face went tight and she said fine. If he was going to be unreasonable, then she would handle this herself. She turned to the guests and announced in her fake cheerful voice that there had been a small misunderstanding, but everything was fine. Adam grabbed my hand hard enough that I felt his fingers pressing into my palm. He pulled me toward the side exit without saying anything to anyone, just moving fast like he needed to get out right that second. His parents stood up from their seats looking confused and upset, following us without asking questions. I stumbled in my heels trying to keep up with Adam while my dress tangled around my legs. The realization hit me like cold water that the cohabitation lie was about to explode on top of everything else Rebecca had done. We made it to the hallway outside the ceremony space, and I could still hear my mother's voice explaining something to the guests. Adam kept walking toward the parking lot, but then stopped suddenly when someone called his name. Estelle, the wedding planner, appeared from around the corner, moving fast in her practical flats. She had her phone in one hand and her clipboard in the other, and her face looked genuinely sorry in a way that made my throat tight. She said she had already called the venue manager about getting our deposit back since Rebecca's interference made it impossible to continue the ceremony. Her voice was gentle when she added that she had worked weddings for 12 years and never seen anything like what just happened. She promised to handle the vendors and make sure we got refunds wherever possible. The kindness in her tone made me want to cry more than anything else that had happened today. Adam thanked her in this flat voice that didn't sound like him at all, then kept pulling me down the hallway. His parents caught up to us and his mother Michaela asked where we were going. Adam said we needed somewhere private to figure things out, and Estelle directed us to the bridal suite on the second floor. We climbed the stairs in silence except for the sound of my dress rustling and Adam's mother's heels clicking on the hardwood. Elliot and Ainsley must have seen us leave because they appeared in the hallway and followed us without asking. We ended up crowded into the bridal suite with Adam's parents standing by the window, and Elliot and Ainsley near the door like they were guarding it. I could hear noise from downstairs where the ceremony space was, voices and movement that meant the chaos was still continuing. Adam sat down on the white couch and put his head in his hands. His mother stayed standing and her voice was quiet but firm when she asked if Adam and I had been living together. The question hung in the air for what felt like forever. Adam lifted his head and looked at his mother, and the defeat in his eyes made my stomach drop. He said yes in a voice barely louder than a whisper. His father Nathaniel made this sound like air leaving a tire. Michaela's face went pale, and she sat down hard in the chair by the makeup mirror. She said they had driven 6 hours and spent thousands on travel and hotel for a wedding built on lies. I watched Adam physically shrink under his father's disappointment, his shoulders curling forward like he was trying to make himself smaller. Nathaniel said they had talked to their church friends about the wedding and bragged about how their son was doing things the right way. I tried to explain that we lied because we knew his religious family wouldn't approve of us living together before marriage. The words sounded hollow even to me as I said them. Michaela looked at me, and the hurt in her voice cut deeper than anger would have. She asked why we didn't just tell the truth if we were going to do what we wanted anyway. I didn't have a good answer for that. The door burst open and my mother came in without knocking, with Rebecca trailing behind her still in that expensive white dress. My mother announced in her bright fake voice that Rebecca had graciously agreed to change clothes, so we could proceed with the ceremony. Rebecca was holding her phone up recording everything, panning across the room to capture everyone's faces. She smiled at the camera and said something about documenting the drama for her followers. Elliot moved faster than I'd ever seen him move, and planted himself directly in front of the door. He told my mother in language I'd never heard him use that nobody wanted them here, and they needed to leave right now. Ainsley didn't say anything but started gathering my personal items from around the suite, shoving my street clothes and shoes into my bag with quick, angry movements. Adam's mother stood up and said they were going back to their hotel. Nathaniel agreed and added that they needed time to process everything that had happened. Michaela wouldn't look at me when she said they would decide tomorrow whether they were staying in town for any rescheduled ceremony. The coldness in her tone felt worse than if she had yelled. My father appeared in the doorway without my mother, and his voice was quiet when he said he would handle getting our vendor payments back and dealing with the venue. He still wouldn't meet my eyes when he apologized, and something about the familiar pattern of it made everything suddenly clear. He had been apologizing for Rebecca my entire life without ever actually stopping her from doing anything. Elliot helped me gather my things from the bridal suite, while Ainsley folded my veil and packed my shoes into the bag I'd brought that morning. Nobody spoke except to ask where I'd left my phone or if I needed my makeup bag. Adam stood by the door watching the hallway to make sure my mother and Rebecca didn't come back. His jaw was tight and I could see him checking his phone every few seconds, probably reading messages from his family. We walked out through the back entrance of the venue to avoid the guests who were still milling around in confusion. Some of them called out asking what was happening, but Elliot just kept walking and I followed him because I couldn't form words to explain. The parking lot felt too bright after being inside, and I had to squint against the sun that seemed wrong for how terrible everything was. Elliot opened the passenger door of his car and waited while I climbed in, still wearing my wedding dress that now felt like a costume. Adam got in the back seat and pulled the door shut hard enough that the whole car shook. Ainsley's car pulled up behind us and she flashed her headlights to show she was ready to follow. The drive to our apartment took 20 minutes and nobody said anything the entire time. Elliot kept his eyes on the road and his hands at 10 and 2 like he was taking a driving test. I watched the streets pass by and saw people walking dogs and pushing strollers and living normal Saturday afternoons that didn't include ruined weddings. Adam's breathing was loud in the quiet car, and I could feel tension coming off him in waves that made my chest hurt. When we pulled into our apartment complex, Elliot parked close to the door and turned off the engine but didn't move to get out. Ainsley parked next to us and came over carrying my bag and the garment bag with my street clothes I'd planned to change into after the reception. We all went upstairs together like a sad parade, and I fumbled with my keys because my hands were shaking. Our apartment looked exactly the same as when we'd left it that morning, which felt impossible. The coffee mugs from breakfast were still in the sink, and Adam's tie that he decided not to wear was draped over the back of a chair. Ainsley set my bags down by the door and hugged me without saying anything. Elliot stood in the middle of our living room looking uncomfortable, like he didn't know what to do with his hands. Adam went straight to the bedroom and closed the door, and I heard him making phone calls in a low, urgent voice. Ainsley asked if I wanted her to stay, but I shook my head, because I needed to be alone with Adam to figure out what happened to us. She hugged me again and whispered that she'd call tomorrow, and then she and Elliot left together. I stood in the living room still wearing my wedding dress and listened to Adam's voice through the bedroom door. He was talking to his mother, and I could hear the stress in his tone even though I couldn't make out the words. When he finally came out, his eyes were red, and he looked exhausted in a way I'd never seen before. We ended up on the couch still in our wedding clothes because changing felt like admitting something I wasn't ready to admit. Adam put his arm around me, and I leaned against him and cried while he stayed silent and tense. His body felt different from usual, like every muscle was tight and ready for something bad to happen. I could feel his heart beating fast through his dress shirt and knew he was dealing with his own crisis, about his family finding out we'd been lying. We stayed like that for hours while the sun went down and the apartment got dark around us. Neither of us got up to turn on lights or change clothes or eat dinner. Adam held me, but it felt mechanical, like he was going through motions instead of really being present. I kept replaying the whole disaster in my head, seeing Rebecca in that dress and my mother taking pictures and the guests whispering about us living together. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Rebecca's smile when she grabbed the microphone and told 200 people I wasn't pure enough for White. Adam's phone kept buzzing with messages, but he ignored it and eventually turned it face down on the coffee table. My phone was somewhere in my bag by the door, and I didn't have the energy to go get it. We finally fell asleep on the couch around 3 a.m, still fully dressed with the TV playing some late-night show neither of us was watching. When I woke up the next morning, my dress was wrinkled and uncomfortable, and my makeup was smeared all over Adam's shirt. He was already awake staring at the ceiling, and I could tell he'd been up for a while. I sat up slowly, and everything hurt like I'd been in a fight. Adam's phone was in his hand, and he was scrolling through something with a grim expression. My bag was still by the door where Ainsley had left it, and I made myself get up to find my phone. The screen lit up with 63 notifications, and I felt sick before I even started reading them. Text messages from aunts and cousins and friends asking what happened and if I was okay. Voicemails from relatives I barely knew wanting details about the drama. A group text from my mother with my aunts and grandmother, where she said I was being dramatic and making Rebecca feel bad for trying to participate in my special day. My mother's message said I needed to apologize to Rebecca for ruining her moment and making her feel unwelcome at a family event. I read it 3 times to make sure I understood correctly that my mother thought I owed Rebecca an apology. There were more messages from my mother directly saying I was overreacting and Rebecca just wanted to feel included since she never got attention for being successful. I turned my phone completely off and threw it back in my bag. Adam was watching me from the couch and asked if I was okay, which was such a stupid question I almost laughed. His phone rang and he looked at the screen and then at me before answering. I could hear his mother's voice on the other end asking him to meet for lunch and saying they needed to talk. Adam agreed and said he'd be there in an hour and hung up. He told me his parents wanted to meet with just him, and I nodded because I understood they needed to process everything without me there. He went to take a shower and change, and I stayed on the couch in my wedding dress because I couldn't make myself move. Adam came out dressed in jeans and a t-shirt and kissed my forehead before leaving. The apartment felt too quiet after he left, and I finally changed out of my dress into sweatpants and one of Adam's hoodies. I tried to watch TV but couldn't focus on anything. I tried to read, but the words didn't make sense. I ended up just sitting on the couch staring at the wall and thinking about how this was supposed to be my wedding day. Adam came back 3 hours later looking worse than when he'd left. His face was pale, and he had this exhausted, defeated look that scared me. He sat down next to me and said his parents were really hurt about us lying to them about living together. They'd told all their church friends we were doing things the right way, and now they felt embarrassed and deceived. But more than that, they were worried about my family's dysfunction and whether Adam was making a mistake marrying into it. His mother had asked if this kind of drama was going to be normal, and if Rebecca always caused problems. His father wanted to know if my mother always enabled bad behavior and dismissed my feelings. Adam said they needed time to think about whether they could support our marriage given what they'd witnessed. I felt physically sick hearing that I might lose Adam because of Rebecca and my mother. My stomach cramped and I had to run to the bathroom where I threw up even though I hadn't eaten anything since yesterday morning. When I came back, Adam was sitting with his head in his hands, looking miserable. I realized his parents had a point that I'd been making excuses for my family for years. I'd normalized my mother's favoritism and Rebecca's need to compete with me, and my father's inability to stand up to either of them. Adam's family was showing me from an outside perspective just how messed up my normal really was. The patterns I'd accepted my whole life suddenly looked different through their eyes, and I felt ashamed that I'd brought Adam into this toxic mess. Elliot showed up around 6 with bags of Chinese food and made us eat even though neither of us wanted to. He sat at our kitchen table and said he'd known my family was messed up since college when he first met them, but watching Rebecca sabotage my wedding was beyond anything he'd imagined possible. He asked how anyone could be that cruel to their own sister, and I didn't have an answer. Elliot stayed for an hour making sure we ate and then left, saying he'd check on us tomorrow. Ainsley arrived right after Elliot left, carrying a bottle of wine and her laptop. She sat up on our coffee table and pulled up a social media page I didn't recognize at first. Then I saw Rebecca's face and realized she'd posted a video. The title said, "When You're the Better Sister," and it already had 8,000 views. Ainsley warned us it was bad before she pressed play. Rebecca appeared on screen in that expensive white dress sitting in what looked like her apartment. She smiled at the camera and started talking about how she wore white to her sister's wedding to prove she was more deserving of marriage. She went through a list of reasons she was superior, including her salary of $200,000 a year compared to my $60,000. Her appearance, which she said was objectively better based on her personal trainer and nutritionist. Her virginity, which she explained in detail, made her pure while I was living in sin. She held up receipts showing what she'd paid the DJ and security and catering staff to cooperate with her disruption. $500 to the DJ, $3,000 to catering for early cocktail hour, $200 to security for an extended lunch break. She showed the dress receipt for $8,000 and the alteration bill for $2,000 more. The video went on for 15 minutes with Rebecca explaining her philosophy that better sisters deserve better treatment and attention. The comment section was brutal, with some people calling her insane and others saying I must have done something to deserve it. Adam watched with his jaw clenched and his hands in fists. When it ended, he said his family would definitely see this since his cousins were friends with Rebecca on social media. He was worried this would convince his parents that my family drama would poison our marriage and they'd tell him to call off the engagement. I called my father back finally, and he answered on the first ring. His voice sounded tired and old when he said my mother was refusing to see that Rebecca did anything wrong. She was claiming Rebecca just wanted to feel included in the wedding festivities, and I was being selfish for not sharing my special day. He said he'd tried to talk to her, but she wouldn't listen and kept defending Rebecca's behavior as harmless fun. I asked him how wearing my dream dress and announcing to 200 people that I wasn't pure enough for white was harmless fun. He sighed and said he didn't know what to do anymore, and he sounded defeated rather than angry, like he'd given up trying to fix anything. I didn't sleep that night, and neither did Adam. We sat on opposite ends of the couch staring at our phones, showing us different versions of the same disaster. My father called me at 6 in the morning and asked if we could meet for breakfast without my mother knowing. I met him at a diner 3 blocks from our apartment where he sat in a corner booth, looking older than I'd ever seen him. He ordered coffee but didn't drink it, and kept tearing his napkin into smaller and smaller pieces. He told me he needed to explain something about my mother and Rebecca that he should have told me years ago. Rebecca was born 6 weeks early and had to stay in the hospital for 2 months with breathing problems and feeding tubes. My mother spent every day at the hospital convinced Rebecca would die. And when she finally came home, my mother treated her like she was made of glass. He said my mother developed this idea that Rebecca needed extra protection and attention because she'd almost lost her, and that mindset never went away even after Rebecca grew up healthy and successful. For 32 years, he'd watched my mother prioritize Rebecca's needs and feelings over mine, and he'd gone along with it to keep peace in the marriage. He said he knew it was wrong, but he didn't know how to stop the pattern now, and he was sorry he'd failed me as a father. I asked him why he was telling me this now instead of 20 years ago when it might have made a difference. He said he thought if he just kept quiet and let my mother handle things eventually, she'd see how much damage she was doing. But instead, it just got worse. I left the diner without finishing my eggs and drove home crying so hard I had to pull over twice. Adam was awake when I got back, and we had the fight I'd been dreading since the wedding. He asked if we should even try to reschedule or just go to the courthouse and sign papers and be done with it. I could hear how tired he was in his voice, like he'd been thinking about this all night. He said he wanted a real wedding with his family there, and our friends celebrating, but not if it meant giving my family more chances to humiliate us in front of everyone we know. I tried to argue that we could have security or keep my family away, but he pointed out that my mother and Rebecca had already proven they'd find ways around any boundaries we set. He said maybe we should just accept that a big wedding wasn't possible with my family's situation and save ourselves the stress and money. I didn't have a good argument against that, because he was right, and we both knew it. We sat in silence for a long time, and then he went to take a shower while I stayed on the couch feeling like my sister had managed to ruin not just my wedding, but my entire relationship. I spent the whole day going through old photo albums and my phone's camera roll looking at pictures from important moments in my life. My high school graduation, where Rebecca showed up in a white dress and told everyone she'd just gotten accepted to law school even though the day was supposed to be about me finishing high school. My college acceptance to state when Rebecca announced at the family dinner that she'd gotten a promotion to senior associate, making twice what my parents earned combined. My first real job offer where Rebecca crashed the celebration lunch and spent an hour talking about her corner office and executive assistant. My engagement party where Rebecca wore a ring bigger than mine and told Adam's parents about all the men who'd proposed to her over the years that she'd turned down because they weren't successful enough. Every single important moment had a Rebecca story attached that made my achievement feel smaller and less important. I found pictures where I was smiling, but I could see the tension around my eyes and the way I was holding my shoulders up near my ears. I looked like someone who was used to being disappointed, and that made me feel sick. Elliot came over without calling first and found me surrounded by photo albums and tissues. He sat down on the floor next to me and started looking through the pictures, and I watched his face change as he realized what I was seeing. He said my mother was in almost every single one of these photos watching Rebecca overshadow me, and she never once told Rebecca to stop or tried to protect me. He picked up a picture from my 16th birthday, where Rebecca had brought her new boyfriend and spent the whole party making out with him in front of my friends. My mother was in the background of the photo smiling at them like it was cute. Elliot said the problem wasn't just Rebecca's narcissism, but my mother's active choice to enable and participate in making me feel less than. He said my mother had been there for every incident and could have stopped it, but instead she encouraged it by praising Rebecca and dismissing my hurt feelings. I'd never thought about it that way before, but he was right, and it made everything feel worse, because it meant both of them had been doing this to me on purpose for my entire life. Adam's parents called that evening and asked if we could come to dinner at their hotel. I was terrified the entire drive there and kept making Adam promise he wouldn't let them talk him out of marrying me. Michaela answered the door of their hotel suite wearing a nice dress like this was a formal occasion, and that made my stomach hurt more. Nathaniel was sitting in one of the chairs by the window, and he stood up when we came in but didn't hug either of us. We sat down at the small table they'd set up with room service food that nobody was eating. Michaela was polite but distant, in a way that felt worse than if she'd just yelled at us. Nathaniel asked detailed questions about why we felt we needed to lie about living together, and how long we'd been planning to keep up the deception. I could feel Adam getting tense next to me, and I knew this was going exactly as badly as I'd feared. I explained honestly that we knew they wouldn't approve of us living together before marriage, and we didn't want to lose their support or have them think badly of us. I said we loved each other, and wanted to build a life together, and living together felt like a natural step, even though we knew his parents' religious beliefs meant they'd see it differently. Michaela said trust is the foundation of marriage, and we'd started our relationship with his family by breaking theirs. She said she understood we were adults making our own choices, but the lying hurt more than the actual living together would have, because it meant we didn't respect them enough to be honest. I could see that the deception had damaged something between us that might not be fixable, and I felt Adam's hand tighten on mine under the table. Adam defended our decision and said his parents' religious expectations put unfair pressure on us to either lie or lose their relationship. He said they'd made it clear over the years that they had strict rules about relationships and marriage, and we'd felt trapped between being honest and being accepted. Nathaniel's face got red, and he said they'd raised Adam with strong values about family and respect, and those values included honesty even when it was difficult. The conversation got tense with Adam and his father going back and forth about whether religious expectations should override personal choices. Michaela tried to calm things down, but Adam kept pushing, saying his parents needed to accept that he was an adult who could make his own decisions. I sat quietly watching the family I'd hoped to join, possibly break apart over my family's chaos spilling into their lives. Nathaniel finally held up his hand to stop the argument, and said he and Michaela needed to see evidence that I could set boundaries with my toxic family before they'd feel comfortable with the marriage proceeding. He said he wasn't trying to be cruel, but he was protecting his son from what he saw as inevitable future drama and dysfunction. He said if I couldn't stand up to my mother and sister now, then every holiday and birthday and family event for the rest of their lives would involve managing my family's behavior. Michaela added that they'd seen how my mother enabled Rebecca, and they were worried about what that would mean for their future grandchildren and family gatherings. I understood they were being protective, but hearing them say out loud that my family was too toxic to marry into made me want to disappear. I called my mother the next day with my hands shaking so hard I almost couldn't dial. I told her I needed her to acknowledge that what Rebecca did was wrong and hurtful, and that she needed to apologize. She sighed like I was being exhausting, and said Rebecca was just having fun, and I needed to learn to share the spotlight instead of being selfish. I could hear her moving around her kitchen making breakfast like this was a normal conversation about nothing important. When I pressed harder and said this wasn't about sharing, but about Rebecca deliberately sabotaging my wedding, she got irritated. She said I'd always been jealous of Rebecca's success and confidence, and maybe if I worked on myself instead of playing victim, I'd be happier. She said Rebecca worked hard for everything she had while I coasted through life expecting things to be handed to me. The words hit like physical blows because I'd heard variations of this my entire life, but never quite this directly. I realized my mother genuinely believed I was the problem, and nothing I said would ever change her mind about who deserved her love and protection. I told her I wouldn't have a relationship with her anymore unless she could admit what Rebecca did was wrong and say she was sorry. My mother laughed like I'd just told the funniest joke she'd heard all week. She said I was being manipulative and I'd come crawling back within a week like I always did. Her voice had this knowing tone that made my stomach hurt because part of me wondered if she was right. I'd never actually followed through on any boundary I'd tried to set with her before. She always wore me down until I gave up and pretended everything was fine. I hung up without saying goodbye and sat on the couch staring at my phone. Adam came out of the bedroom where he'd been giving me privacy for the call. He asked how long I'd been accepting treatment like that from my mother. I didn't know how to answer because I'd never really thought about it as accepting anything. It was just how things were in my family. But hearing the conversation through Adam's ears made me realize how messed up it actually was. He sat down next to me and said my mother had basically told me I didn't matter, and my feelings were stupid and I'd just taken it like that was normal. I started crying because he was right, and I'd been so trained to accept it that I didn't even recognize how bad it was anymore. The next morning, I searched online for therapists who worked with family problems. I found one who specialized in dealing with narcissistic family members and made an appointment for the following week. The first session was harder than I expected. I sat in her office trying to explain my family and watching her face change as I described things I thought were just regular family stuff. She asked questions about my childhood and my relationship with my mother and Rebecca. Every answer I gave seemed to make her more concerned. She took notes and nodded and said things like that must have been really difficult for you. By the end of the hour, I felt exhausted from talking about it all. She scheduled me for weekly appointments and said we had a lot to work through. Over the next few sessions, she helped me understand patterns I'd never noticed before. She explained that I'd been trained since I was little to make my needs smaller so my mother wouldn't get upset. She said Rebecca learned early on that she could take whatever she wanted from me and nobody would stop her. Understanding why it happened didn't make it hurt any less, but at least it started making sense. I'd spent my whole life managing my mother's emotions and making sure Rebecca was happy, and I'd never realized that wasn't my job. My phone rang while I was making dinner one night, and Rebecca's name showed up on the screen. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity won. She started talking immediately like nothing had happened, asking if I'd seen how many views her wedding video got. She sounded excited and proud. When I told her she ruined my wedding, she laughed and said I was being dramatic about a dress and some photos. I felt my hands start shaking. I told her exactly how her stunt affected me and Adam and his whole family. I explained that Adam's parents almost didn't want him to marry me because of what she did. Rebecca's response was that if Adam couldn't handle a little family drama, then he was too weak for me anyway. Her voice had zero guilt or concern in it. She genuinely didn't think she'd done anything wrong. The complete lack of remorse made something click in my head. She wasn't going to suddenly realize she'd hurt me. She didn't care that she'd hurt me. Rebecca kept talking and said our mother agreed that I overreacted and I should actually be grateful she made my boring wedding memorable. I realized they'd been discussing me together and building up this story where I was the problem. They'd probably been on the phone multiple times reinforcing each other's version of events. My mother had probably been complaining about how difficult I was being, and Rebecca had been agreeing and adding her own complaints. I interrupted her and said I was done having a relationship with her until she could admit what she did and really apologize. Rebecca said fine. She didn't need a sister who was jealous and bitter anyway. Then she hung up on me before I could say anything else. My father called 2 days later. His voice sounded tired and sad. He begged me not to cut off my mother and sister. He said family was supposed to forgive each other and move forward. I asked him why I was always the one expected to forgive and move forward while Rebecca never faced any consequences for anything she did. He got quiet for a long time. Then he said it was complicated and I didn't understand how hard it was for him being in the middle. I told him he wasn't in the middle, he was on their side by refusing to hold them accountable. He sighed and said he'd call me later after I calmed down. That night, Adam and I sat up late having the hardest conversation we'd had since the wedding. He said he loved me, but he was scared of spending our whole lives dealing with my mother's favoritism and Rebecca's sabotage at every important moment. He worried about future kids and holidays and birthdays. He asked what would happen when we had children and my mother favored Rebecca's kids over ours. What would happen at our kids' graduations or weddings if Rebecca decided to make those about herself too? I didn't have good answers because I was worried about the same things. I promised him I was serious about the boundaries and protecting our relationship. I showed him the therapist appointments I'd already scheduled for the next 2 months. I explained the plan I was developing for limiting contact with my family. He wanted to believe me, but I could see doubt in his eyes. He'd watched me cave to my family's pressure my entire life, and he wasn't sure I could actually change. I wasn't totally sure either, but I had to try. We went to bed that night without resolving anything, just holding each other and hoping we could figure it out. The next morning, I opened my laptop and pulled up the calendar app to show Adam all the therapy appointments I'd already booked. Every Tuesday at 4 for the next 8 weeks, plus 2 Saturday sessions when the therapist had openings. I showed him the document I'd started writing about boundaries with my family, listing specific limits like no unannounced visits and no discussing my life with Rebecca. He read through everything carefully while I sat next to him on the couch, feeling like I was presenting evidence in a trial. His face stayed neutral the whole time, which made my stomach hurt worse than if he'd looked angry. When he finished reading, he set the laptop down and took my hand, but I could see the doubt in his eyes even though he said the words about believing I could change. He wanted to trust that I meant it this time, but we both knew I'd promised to stand up to my family before and always ended up backing down. I asked him what else I could do to prove I was serious, and he just shook his head and said time would tell. We sat there holding hands without talking for a long time, and I felt the weight of our relationship hanging on, whether I could actually follow through. 3 days later, Ainsley came over with her laptop and helped me write a message to my extended family explaining what happened at the wedding. She kept deleting sentences where I apologized or made excuses for Rebecca's behavior. Every time I typed something like, I know Rebecca didn't mean to cause problems, or I should have handled it better, Ainsley would hit backspace and tell me to stick to the facts. We went through 7 drafts before she approved the final version that simply stated Rebecca wore a wedding dress to my ceremony, announced I wasn't pure enough to wear white, and refused to leave when asked. I wanted to add more context about how maybe Rebecca was going through something or felt left out, but Ainsley said no. The facts spoke for themselves. Hitting send on that message made my hands shake because I knew my mother would see it and be furious that I was telling people what really happened instead of her version. Within an hour, my phone started lighting up with responses from aunts, uncles, and cousins I hadn't heard from in months. The messages were split almost evenly between people who supported me and people who thought I was causing drama. My Aunt Lisa sent 3 paragraphs about how families should forgive each other and move forward without holding grudges. My cousin Janus said he'd always known Rebecca was difficult, and he was sorry I had to deal with her sabotage. My mother's sister called me directly instead of texting and spent 20 minutes explaining that I was being cruel to Rebecca, who just wanted to feel special for once in her life. She said Rebecca worked so hard at her career and never got to dress up or be the center of attention, so wearing a pretty dress to my wedding was just her way of participating in the celebration. I tried to explain that Rebecca could have worn any dress except a wedding dress, but my aunt kept talking over me saying I was being selfish and rigid about traditions that didn't really matter. When I finally got off the phone, I felt exhausted and confused, like maybe I was overreacting after all. Ainsley had to remind me that wearing a wedding dress to someone else's wedding and announcing the bride wasn't pure enough for White wasn't participating in a celebration. It was deliberately cruel. Over the next few days, I started noticing a pattern in the responses from relatives who sided with Rebecca. They all used similar language about me overreacting and being dramatic and not being able to share the spotlight. I realized my mother must have been calling people and giving them her version of events before they saw my message. Several cousins mentioned that Rebecca had posted a video explaining her side, and when I finally looked it up, I felt sick. The video had 15,000 views and hundreds of comments calling me jealous and bitter. Rebecca had edited it to make herself look like a victim of my insecurity, showing clips of her in the dress and talking about how she just wanted to celebrate her sister's big day by looking nice. She never mentioned announcing I wasn't pure or refusing to leave when asked. Half my extended family had seen that video before reading my message and already believed I was the problem. My mother's narrative about Rebecca making an innocent fashion choice and me throwing a tantrum had spread through the family faster than the truth. Elliot came over that evening and suggested I post my own video explaining what actually happened with footage from the wedding if we had any. I told him I didn't even know if the photographer had captured Rebecca's entrance since she'd paid him to focus on her. Elliot pulled up Rebecca's video on his phone and started taking screenshots of the comments section where people were calling me names and saying I didn't deserve a wedding if I couldn't be happy for my sister. He wanted me to respond publicly and set the record straight, but I wasn't sure that was the right move. The next day at my therapy appointment, I asked my therapist about posting a response video, and she immediately advised against it. She explained that engaging in public battles with narcissists usually backfires because they're better at manipulation and playing the victim than most people realize. My therapist said narcissists like Rebecca thrive on attention, whether it's positive or negative, and responding publicly would just give her more fuel. Instead, she suggested I focus on private conversations with people who actually mattered to me and let the others believe whatever they wanted. That advice felt wrong at first because I wanted everyone to know the truth. But my therapist pointed out that trying to control what everyone thinks about me was exhausting and impossible. 2 weeks after the ruined wedding, Adam's parents called and asked to meet with just me, without Adam present. I drove to their hotel, feeling like I was going to throw up the entire way there. When I arrived, Michaela opened the door, and her face looked softer than it had at our last meeting. She'd printed out a stack of articles about narcissistic family systems and personality disorders, and she'd highlighted sections that described my family dynamics exactly. Nathaniel sat next to her on the hotel couch while I read through the articles, and I felt tears running down my face, because someone finally understood what I'd been dealing with my whole life. The articles talked about golden children and scapegoats, about enabling parents and siblings who compete for attention through sabotage. Every paragraph could have been written about my mother, Rebecca, and me. Michaela reached over and squeezed my hand while I read and said she was sorry for not understanding sooner how difficult my family situation was. She'd spent hours researching after our last conversation because she wanted to understand why a sister would sabotage a wedding and why a mother would allow it. Nathaniel cleared his throat and said they'd been wrong to make our marriage conditional on my family's behavior because I couldn't control what my mother and Rebecca did, only how I responded to them. His voice was gentle when he apologized for adding pressure when I was already dealing with trauma from the wedding. He said they'd been so focused on the lying about living together that they hadn't seen the bigger picture of why we felt we needed to lie in the first place. Adam had apparently talked to them about my family history and how I'd been conditioned since childhood to manage everyone else's emotions and keep peace at any cost. Michaela added that they should have recognized I was a victim of family dysfunction rather than judging me for the coping mechanisms I'd developed to survive it. Hearing Adam's parents say these things made me cry harder, because my own parents had never acknowledged any of this or tried to understand my perspective. Michaela asked what boundaries I was planning to set with my family going forward, and I explained my plan to limit contact with my mother until she could acknowledge the harm she'd caused and cut off Rebecca entirely until she showed real remorse and change. I told them about the therapy appointments and the document I was creating about specific limits and consequences. Nathaniel nodded and said those boundaries sounded healthy and necessary for protecting myself and my future marriage. Michaela asked if I really thought my mother would ever acknowledge her favoritism and enabling behavior, and I admitted I didn't know, but I couldn't keep having a relationship with her while she dismissed my feelings and defended Rebecca. We talked for over an hour about what healthy family relationships should look like, and how Adam's family operated so differently from mine. They asked questions about my childhood and specific incidents where my mother had chosen Rebecca over me, and I found myself sharing stories I'd never told anyone because they felt too painful or embarrassing. Before I left, Michaela hugged me tight and said she was proud of me for choosing myself and setting boundaries, even though it was hard. Those words made me start crying again because my own mother had never said anything like that to me in my entire life. Nathaniel said they would support whatever timeline we needed for rescheduling the wedding, and they weren't going to pressure us about anything anymore. They just wanted Adam to be happy, and they could see that meant being with me, so they were committed to supporting our relationship however they could. Driving home from that meeting, I felt lighter than I had in weeks because Adam's parents saw me and believed me and were on my side. It made the loss of my own parents' support hurt less somehow, knowing I was gaining a family that actually functioned in healthy ways. 2 months after the ruined wedding, I was going to therapy every week and feeling clearer about my family patterns than I ever had before. My mother had called 17 times and I'd answered exactly twice, keeping both conversations under 5 minutes and ending them the moment she started dismissing my feelings or defending Rebecca. The first call, she'd cried and begged me to forgive Rebecca and move on like nothing happened. The second call, she'd gotten angry and accused me of being cruel and holding grudges. Both times, I'd calmly repeated my boundary that I wouldn't discuss Rebecca with her, and I needed her to acknowledge that what happened at the wedding was wrong before we could move forward. Both times, she'd refused, and I'd ended the call. My therapist said I was doing exactly the right thing by staying consistent with my boundaries, even when my mother tried different tactics to break them down. I blocked Rebecca on every social media platform 2 days after that conversation where she showed zero remorse about ruining my wedding. Elliot told me she was still posting stories about her amazing life and making vague references to her jealous, bitter sister who couldn't handle her success. He showed me one screenshot before I asked him to stop because seeing her face made my chest tight with anger. I was still learning to process in therapy. My therapist said blocking her was healthy self-protection, and I shouldn't feel guilty about cutting off access to someone who consistently hurt me. Ainsley mentioned that several mutual friends had reached out asking if they should stop following Rebecca, and I told them to do whatever felt right for them, but please don't update me about her content anymore. I needed space from Rebecca's version of reality where she was the victim and I was the villain. My therapist had me keep a journal of moments when I felt tempted to check Rebecca's social media and write down what I was actually feeling underneath that urge. Most of the time, it was a need for validation that what happened was really as bad as I remembered, or a desperate hope that she might have posted an apology. Neither of those things were going to happen through stalking her online, so I focused on other ways to process the grief. 3 weeks into my consistent blocking strategy, I sat down at my kitchen table with my laptop and started writing a letter to Rebecca that I knew I would never send. My therapist had suggested this exercise as a way to say everything I needed to say without actually giving Rebecca the opportunity to dismiss or attack me again. I wrote for 2 hours straight about specific incidents from our childhood where she had sabotaged or overshadowed my moments. The time she told everyone at my 8th grade graduation party that I only got honors because the teachers felt sorry for me. The time she showed up to my college acceptance celebration dinner and announced she'd gotten into a better school with a full scholarship. The time she convinced my high school boyfriend that I was cheating on him so he broke up with me right before prom. I wrote about how her behavior at my wedding wasn't an isolated incident, but the culmination of 30 years of making sure I never got to feel special or celebrated. I explained exactly what I had needed from a sister, which was someone who protected me and cheered for me, instead of competing with me and tearing me down. I wrote about the pain of realizing our mother had enabled this dynamic my entire life by praising Rebecca's cruelty as confidence and dismissing my hurt as jealousy. By the time I finished the letter, I was crying, but it felt different from the angry, helpless tears I'd cried before. These tears felt like release and acceptance that the sister relationship I'd always wanted was never going to exist. My therapist read the letter during our next session and said it showed real growth in my ability to name the harm and grieve what I'd lost. She reminded me the letter was for my healing, not for changing Rebecca, and I should keep it somewhere safe as a reminder of why my boundaries were necessary. My father texted me asking to meet for coffee without my mother knowing, which immediately made my stomach drop. We met at a place across town where none of our relatives would see us, and he looked older than I remembered from the wedding. He ordered black coffee and sat across from me fidgeting with his cup for a full minute before speaking. He admitted he'd been enabling the dysfunction between my mother and Rebecca for over 30 years, because confronting it was harder than just keeping peace. He said watching Rebecca destroy my wedding had finally made him see how bad things had gotten and how much damage his silence had caused. He told me he was proud of me for setting boundaries even though they were making family gatherings uncomfortable, and my mother was furious with both of us. I wanted to feel relieved that he finally understood, but mostly I felt sad that it had taken this long, and this much pain for him to acknowledge what I'd been living with my whole life. He asked what he could do to help repair our relationship, and I appreciated that he was asking instead of just assuming everything would go back to normal. We talked for over an hour about specific ways he'd chosen my mother's comfort over my well-being, and he didn't make excuses or try to minimize any of it. He said he understood if I needed time and space from him too, because he'd earned my distrust through years of letting me down. Before we left, he hugged me tight and said he wished he'd been a better father and he was going to try to do better now, even though it was probably too late. 2 days after that coffee meeting, I called my father and told him something I'd been thinking about since we talked. I said I loved him, but I couldn't have a relationship with him if he kept facilitating my mother's access to me and information about my life. That meant no passing along my phone number if I changed it, and no sharing details about where I lived or what I was doing. It meant not pressuring me to attend family events where Rebecca would be present, and not guilt-tripping me about my mother's hurt feelings. He was quiet for a long time before asking if I was really going to make him choose between his wife and his daughter. I told him I wasn't making him choose anything, but I was protecting myself from people who hurt me, and if he couldn't respect my boundaries, then he was choosing to participate in that hurt. He sighed this heavy, sad sigh and said he understood what I was saying, but my mother was his partner of 35 years, and he couldn't just cut her off or hide things from her. I felt something break in my chest hearing him say that, because I'd known deep down he was going to choose my mother like he always had, but hearing it out loud still hurt. I told him I loved him, and I hoped someday he'd be able to have a relationship with me that wasn't filtered through my mother's feelings, but until then, I needed to limit our contact. He said he was sorry, and he did love me, even if he couldn't show it the way I needed. We hung up, and I sat on my couch crying for an hour because losing my father, even though he'd never really been there for me, felt like another layer of grief I had to process. Adam found me crying and held me while I explained the conversation with my father. He said he was sorry my dad couldn't step up, but he was glad I'd stated my needs clearly instead of hoping things would magically change. We talked about what our wedding should look like now that my family wasn't going to be part of it, and I admitted I felt sad about that, even though I knew it was necessary. Adam suggested we do something small with just the people who actually supported us, and I realized that sounded perfect, and also terrifying. Planning a wedding without worrying about my mother's opinions or Rebecca's potential sabotage felt freeing, but it also meant accepting that my family really wasn't going to be there for the biggest moments of my life. We decided to have a ceremony with just Adam's family plus Elliot and Ainsley, and maybe a few other close friends who had reached out with genuine support after the wedding disaster. Adam's parents had a beautiful backyard, and Michaela had already offered to host whatever we wanted whenever we were ready. I made a list of about 30 people total who we actually wanted present, and it felt right in a way the original 200-person wedding never had. Planning became exciting instead of stressful, because every choice was about what we actually wanted, rather than managing other people's expectations or preventing my family's drama. 3 months after the original wedding date, we got married in Adam's parents' backyard on a sunny Saturday afternoon in early fall. Michaela had decorated with simple white flowers and lights strung through the trees, and it looked magical without being over the top. Nathaniel officiated using a ceremony script he'd written specifically for us that mentioned our journey and growth. There were 32 people total sitting in white chairs on the grass, and every single person there genuinely loved us and wanted us to be happy. I wore a new dress that I'd picked out with Ainsley, and it cost a third of what my original dress cost, but I felt beautiful in it. Adam wore a navy suit, and when I walked down the aisle with Elliot on one side and Ainsley on the other, he started crying happy tears. Nobody sabotaged anything or tried to make it about themselves. Nobody wore white except me. Nobody gave speeches about who deserved what or made comparisons or pulled focus. Michaela cried during the vows, and Nathaniel's voice cracked when he pronounced us married. Adam's brother took photos on his nice camera, and they were full of genuine smiles and joy. The reception was a catered dinner under the lights, followed by dancing to a playlist we'd made together. I felt present and joyful in every moment, in a way I couldn't have at the original wedding because I wasn't waiting for the next disaster or managing anyone's feelings except my own. The ceremony itself was simple and beautiful in ways that mattered more than expensive flowers or fancy venues. Adam's vows talked about my strength and growth over the past few months, and how he was proud to marry someone who chose herself even when it was hard. I cried through my own vows about finding a family that actually saw and valued me. When Nathaniel announced us as married, everyone cheered, and it felt real in a way I'm not sure the original ceremony would have even if Rebecca hadn't ruined it. We cut a small cake that Michaela had made and toasted with champagne, and danced until the sun set completely. Elliot gave a short speech about watching me find my voice, and Ainsley told embarrassing college stories that made everyone laugh. Adam's grandmother pulled me aside and said she could see how happy Adam was, and that was all that mattered to her. Several of Adam's relatives told me they were glad to have me in the family, and I believed them because they'd shown up for us when my own family wouldn't. Driving away from the reception with Adam as my actual legal husband felt surreal and perfect, and I was grateful we'd waited until we could do it right. 2 days after the wedding, a card arrived in the mail with my father's handwriting on the envelope. Inside was a check for $5,000 and a note saying he wished he could have been there, and he was proud of me and he hoped the money would help us start our marriage. I appreciated the gesture because I knew it was his way of showing support within the limits my mother had set for him. But I was also clear with myself that his absence had been his choice, and I wasn't responsible for managing his guilt about it. I deposited the check and sent him a brief thank you text without offering to meet up or share details about the ceremony. My therapist said I was doing a good job maintaining boundaries while still acknowledging his gesture, and I felt proud of myself for not falling back into old patterns of making my father feel better about letting me down. My mother left an angry voicemail 3 days after the wedding, saying I was cruel and selfish for excluding family. She said I would regret this when I was older, and my children asked why they didn't know their grandmother. She said Rebecca was heartbroken that I was holding a grudge over a simple misunderstanding, and my father was depressed because I'd cut him off over nothing. The voicemail was 4 minutes long and full of the same dismissive language and guilt trips I'd heard my entire life. I saved it in a folder on my phone labeled Reasons for Boundaries, because my therapist said it was helpful to have concrete reminders when I felt tempted to doubt myself. Then I deleted my mother's number from my contacts, so I wouldn't be tempted to call her back during weak moments. Adam asked if I was okay after listening to it, and I said I was sad, but also relieved because her reaction proved I'd made the right choice. 6 weeks after our actual wedding, Adam and I were settling into married life in ways that felt surprisingly normal and healthy. We'd gotten into a routine of cooking dinner together and talking about our days and making plans for the future that didn't involve managing my family's drama. Michaela started calling me every Tuesday just to chat about random things like recipes she wanted to try or books she was reading. The calls weren't about checking on me or asking about my family situation. They were just normal mother-daughter-in-law conversations that made me feel like part of their family. Nathaniel sent me encouraging texts every few days about my therapy progress and articles he'd found about family systems and boundaries. Adam's brother added me to the family group chat, where everyone shared memes and made plans for holidays. I was learning what healthy family relationships looked like through watching how Adam's family operated, and it was completely different from anything I'd experienced growing up. They asked questions and listened to answers. They respected boundaries without making people feel guilty. They celebrated each other's successes without competition or comparison. They apologized when they messed up and actually changed their behavior. Being part of that kind of family felt strange and wonderful, and I was grateful every day that I'd protected my relationship with Adam so we could build this life together. Elliot sent out invitations for a party 2 weeks after our backyard wedding and called it a celebration of new beginnings. He rented out the private room at our favorite restaurant downtown and invited everyone who'd been at the actual ceremony, plus some friends who couldn't make it. When Adam and I walked in, everyone cheered and clinked their glasses, and I felt this warmth spread through my chest that I'd never experienced at the original wedding attempt. The room was decorated with simple white flowers and string lights, and there was a cake that said, "Finally Married" in blue frosting. Ainsley pulled me aside before dinner started and said she wanted to make a speech during dessert. I told her she didn't have to, but she insisted that she'd been planning what to say for weeks. During the meal, I looked around at the 30 people eating and laughing and realized every single person in this room genuinely cared about me and Adam. Nobody was there out of obligation or family pressure. Nobody was going to sabotage anything or make the night about themselves. When dessert came, Ainsley stood up with her wine glass and the room got quiet. She talked about meeting me freshman year of college when I was this quiet girl who apologized for everything and never took up space. She said she watched me shrink myself smaller and smaller over the years to avoid conflict with my family. Then she said the past few months she'd watched me find my voice and set boundaries and choose myself for the first time. Her voice got thick with emotion when she said she was proud to stand beside me as I built a life with people who actually wanted me to shine. Everyone raised their glasses and Adam squeezed my hand under the table, and I had to blink back tears because this was what a real celebration felt like. Elliot gave a shorter speech about how marriage was about choosing your partner every day and building a family that supported instead of tore down. Several other friends shared quick stories and toasts, and by the end of the night, my face hurt from smiling. We stayed until the restaurant staff started cleaning up around us, and when we finally left, I felt lighter than I had in months. 3 days after the party, I got a message on social media from my cousin Jennifer, who I'd been close with when we were kids but hadn't talked to much as adults. She said she'd been following my journey over the past few months through mutual friends and family gossip. She wrote that watching me set boundaries with my mother and Rebecca had inspired her to finally address her own toxic family situation with her parents. Jennifer said my mother and Rebecca had been talking badly about me at family gatherings and painting me as the villain who abandoned them over nothing. But she said several relatives, including her, were starting to see through their version of events, especially after Rebecca's video went viral. Jennifer wrote that she was tired of being the family peacekeeper and watching people get hurt by others who never faced consequences. She asked if we could meet for coffee sometime, because she wanted advice on how to start setting her own boundaries without feeling crushing guilt. I read her message 3 times, feeling this strange mix of sadness and validation. It hurt knowing my mother and Rebecca were still spreading lies about me, but it also felt good knowing some family members were questioning their narrative. I wrote back saying I'd love to meet up, and gave her my therapist's contact information, because professional help had been huge for me. We made plans to get coffee the following week, and I felt grateful that something positive might come from all the pain my family had caused. My therapy appointments had become the anchor point of my week where I could process everything without judgment. During one session, about 3 months after the wedding, my therapist asked me to talk about the grief I was feeling around losing my mother and sister. I said it felt weird to grieve people who were still alive, but she explained that I was mourning the relationships I'd hoped to have with them, not the actual people they were. We spent the hour talking about how my mother would never be the supportive parent I deserved, and Rebecca would never be the sister I needed. My therapist helped me see that choosing myself and setting boundaries didn't make me selfish or cruel. She said real love doesn't require someone to accept mistreatment or abuse. I cried during that session more than I had in previous ones because accepting that my family would never change felt like letting go of hope I'd carried my entire life. But afterward, I also felt this sense of peace, like I'd finally given myself permission to stop waiting for them to become different people. My therapist assigned me homework to write a letter to my younger self explaining that none of the family dysfunction was my fault, and I deserved better. Writing that letter was harder than I expected, but it helped me separate my worth from my family's treatment of me. Over the following weeks, I noticed I was having fewer moments of doubt about my boundaries, and more confidence that I'd made the right choices. A year after Rebecca walked down my aisle in that white dress, I was sitting on our apartment balcony with my morning coffee thinking about how different my life looked now. Adam and I had settled into married life in ways that felt easy and natural. We'd developed our own traditions and inside jokes and built a home that felt safe and peaceful. I still had sad moments when I thought about my mother or saw other women with their sisters doing normal family things. Sometimes I wondered if I'd made a mistake cutting them off or if I should try one more time to fix things. But then I'd remember my mother's voicemail calling me cruel and selfish, or Rebecca's complete lack of remorse, and I knew I'd made the right choice. My relationship with Adam's family had grown stronger over the year with regular dinners and holidays and phone calls that felt genuine. Michaela had become the mother figure I'd always needed, and Nathaniel treated me like his own daughter. Elliot and Ainsley remained my closest friends and my support system when I needed to talk through hard feelings. Jennifer and I had coffee monthly, and she'd successfully set boundaries with her own parents using tools from therapy. My life wasn't perfect, and I still dealt with anxiety and guilt sometimes. But I was genuinely happy in a way I'd never been when I was trying to please my family. I'd built the life I deserved with people who truly loved me, and that felt like the best possible outcome even if it wasn't the one I'd originally wanted.